Welcome. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We have the site manager here from the Garfield National Historic Site, Todd Arrington.
Thanks, Kaylee. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for continuing to support these programs even during this very strange time that we're living through right now. So it's nice to be on with all of you today. I appreciate everyone's interest in this topic, especially since I think a lot of people are kind of had their fill of politics lately. Obviously, we just passed through a presidential election, and I guess at least in some people's minds, it's still going on. So, there's, regardless of which side you happen to be on, you're still hearing quite a bit about politics and elections right now. But as always, we at James A. Garfield National Historic Site are much more comfortable and much better qualified to talk about politics from the 19th century than we are about today. So we'll leave 2020 out of it, and we'll stick with today's topic at hand. This series of programs that we've been doing now since I believe 2012. So this is like the 8th or 9th year, which is great. Oh, and by the way, if you're interested, we are continuing on in 2021. I did just send the full list of 2021 programs to Kaylee last week or 2 weeks ago. So those should be out and available for you to see what we'll be talking about in 2021. So thanks to Kaylee and everybody at Mentor Public Library for continuing to support this program series. We will continue to do them in this virtual format until Mentor Public Library has in-person programs again, whenever that may be. So, obviously none of us know quite how long this is all going to go on. We will continue to take our lead from the folks at Mentor Public Library, and whenever they've gotten the permission to bring people back into the library for programs, then we'll start doing them there. But until then, we'll continue to offer them in this format, which again is not perfect, but it's certainly, I hope, people feel better than nothing. So we will continue on in 2021. So the topic today, again, since we did just go through a presidential election, is looking at the election of 1864. I'm actually, now that I'm thinking about it, not sure if I've ever actually prepared a program for this series about the election of 1860, which was the year that Abraham Lincoln was initially elected. But today what we're looking at is his re-election campaign in 1864. And of course, 1864 is a very unique year in American history for a lot of reasons, but probably most significantly because we did have a presidential election in the middle of not only wartime, but in the middle of a civil war where, the country is literally fighting against itself. And so this is a very unique situation. And, there was the war was a referendum on Lincoln and on his management of the war and whether or not people wanted the war to continue, or did they want the Union to negotiate a peace with the Confederacy. So we'll talk about all these things as we go through. As always, we only have so much time, and I'm sure some of you probably have to finish by 1 and get back to work or whatever else you want to do today. So I'll try to get through these as quickly as I can, and then as Kaylee indicated, I'll be happy to take questions at the end. So what is the situation here in 1864 as the presidential election is, really the presidential campaign is starting to gear up a little bit. The Union, of course, everybody knows, anybody who studies the Civil War at all knows that the first couple of years of the war were not great for the North. That had started to turn a little bit by 1863. So by 1863, the North did win some pretty significant victories. Gettysburg, Vicksburg, places like that, very famous battles. But it was not a perfect year for the North in that there were certainly defeats on the battlefield as well. Chancellorsville is probably Robert E. Lee's most masterful battle as a Confederate commander. And then of course Chickamauga, which was a major defeat for the North down in Georgia. And of course I mentioned that one primarily because our own James A. Garfield actually fought at Chickamauga. He was there as the chief of staff to the Army of the Cumberland. In late 1863, in fact, the anniversary of this event will be tomorrow, November 19th, 1863. Lincoln went to Gettysburg and spoke at the dedication of the National Cemetery there. That's where he delivered the very famous Gettysburg Address. And that's where he really, I think, laid out what the war was really all about at this point for the North. It was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was about that new birth of freedom for everyone. And so, therefore, not only preserving the Union, but incorporating abolition of slavery into what the Union was really fighting for by that point in late 1863. So as 1864 begins, this is kind of the situation. The North is doing much better on the battlefield, but still has a long way to go. And of course, Lincoln has made the war about more than just preservation of the Union, but now also about abolition of slavery. So many people suggested to Lincoln that he would be well within his rights to delay the presidential election, to actually postpone it indefinitely because of the war, the situation with the war. Lincoln, I think to his credit, decided that no, that was not a good idea. The Constitution says we have elections every 4 years, and regardless of what the situation is in the country, that election still needs to be held. So Lincoln decided to not to delay the election. The election would proceed in early November as always. But Lincoln went into 1864 pretty convinced that he was not going to win re-election. The war again had really only started to go even somewhat well for the North. Lincoln was of the opinion that in all likelihood he would not be reelected in 1864. Obviously, a number of things happened that did allow him to be reelected. And we'll talk about those as we go through. But as the year began, rather, Lincoln really felt like he probably would not be reelected. And you see that quote there where he says to somebody, "You think I don't know I'm going to be beaten, but I do. And unless some great change takes place, beaten badly." There were a number of Republicans, certainly most Democrats, but even some Republicans wanted Lincoln to step aside. They felt like he was, because of the way the war had been going for the North, he was kind of a drag on the Republican Party and a drag on the country, and that the party would be better served to have someone else step in as their candidate in 1864, and that would give the Republicans, in their view, at least a better chance of winning the election. Lincoln obviously chose not to do that. He did decide that he was still the best candidate for the Republican Party and to lead the country through the rest of the war, and obviously we're great at. So what was it exactly that made the Republicans so concerned? What made Lincoln so concerned that he wasn't going to win, and what made other Republicans so concerned that they actually thought Lincoln maybe should step aside? War fatigue obviously is a big one. The war had been going on at this point for approaching 3 years, massive numbers of casualties. Northerners, Southerners too, of course, but in this case, we're primarily talking about Northerners. Were tired of seeing, thousands and thousands of their sons, husbands, brothers come home in caskets. And so there was a lot of war fatigue. People were just getting tired of the conflict. There were many people who were upset about the Emancipation Proclamation. Not every Northerner was an abolitionist. Not even every Republican was an abolitionist. There were plenty of people who felt like, okay, slavery is immoral, or it's, it goes against the Bible, or they were opposed to slavery for any number of reasons, but still didn't necessarily feel like African Americans were the equals of white men. And so there was a lot of resentment about the Emancipation Proclamation, not so much for getting rid of slavery, but based on the assumption that, well, if we're getting rid of slavery, then that must mean that Lincoln intends to lift black men up to be the equals of white men, and that really bothered a lot of people. There also was concern that the Democrats would elect a so-called peace candidate, meaning someone whose stance on the war was that the war should end immediately and that the North and South should negotiate a peace. And that was appealing, obviously, to a lot of people. And so Republicans really worried that if the Democrats nominated a peace candidate, then that candidate would potentially have an advantage over Lincoln and potentially win the election. There were others, of course, as I mentioned already, who perhaps thought they would be a better candidate. And so Republicans worried that there would, challenges from within the party would be bad press for the party, and it would make it seem like the party wasn't united behind Lincoln, which at least for a time they were not. So that would have been a legitimate concern. And then there was this idea of, how many of the soldiers that were serving at the front in the Union armies and Navy were actually going to be able to vote, and who would the soldiers vote for? Would they vote for Lincoln? And because obviously a vote for Lincoln was a vote for continuing the war, or would they vote for this potential Democratic peace candidate? We just didn't know how the soldiers, one, would they be able to vote at all, and two, who would they vote for? So these things all were sort of combining to give Republicans a lot of indigestion, we'll say, as 1864 began and people started to really think about the upcoming election. Ulysses S. Grant, who you see on the slide here, was, besides Lincoln himself, perhaps by 1864, one of the most famous men in the country. In early 1864, Lincoln promoted him, actually resurrected the rank of lieutenant general, which hadn't been used since George Washington. He promoted Grant to lieutenant general and gave him overall command of Union forces. If you're a Civil War, an avid reader of Civil War history, Lincoln struggled to find really good, competent generals for a couple of years, and then finally, when he found Grant, he moved quickly to make Grant the overall commander of Union forces, not just in the West, where Grant had been fighting since the war's early days, but of overall command of all Union forces throughout the entire country. There were elements in both parties that thought Grant himself would be an appealing presidential candidate. Democrats and Republicans alike talked, whispered in Grant's ear about the possibility of him running for president against Lincoln in 1864. Grant, of course, had no interest in this in 1864 because he had a job to do, which was defeating the Confederacy and winning the war. And of course, the same thing happened about a century later with Dwight Eisenhower, where both parties wanted him to run. Everyone knew that he could be elected president, and both parties wanted him to declare himself a member of their own party. And of course, in Eisenhower's case and in Grant's case, they did end up running as Republicans, of course. Grant, is honest with Lincoln and lets him know he has zero interest in running for president in 1864, at least. So Lincoln does not have to worry that Grant might, kind of swoop into Washington and declare himself a presidential candidate. Salmon P. Chase was another Republican who very much wanted to be president and who at least some people thought maybe would be a good replacement for Lincoln at the top of the ticket in 1864. Chase, of course, most of you probably know, was from Ohio. So he is from the Buckeye State. He was working for Lincoln as Secretary of the Treasury. Chase had been one of that so-called team of rivals who had sought the Republican nomination in 1860. When Lincoln won the nomination and then won election to the presidency in 1860, as Doris Kearns Goodwin has talked about in her book, Team of Rivals, very famously brought a lot of those other Republicans who had run against him for the nomination into the cabinet. Chase was one of those who had sought the presidency in 1860 and then ended up as the Secretary of the Treasury. But again, Chase unlike Grant at this point, Chase very much wanted to be president. And Chase was not at all shy about kind of behind the scenes letting people know that and, sort of stoking the fires of this draft Chase movement, which really was just a movement trying to convince people that Chase would be a better Republican candidate in 1864 than Abraham Lincoln. And our own James Garfield actually was kind of courted to be part of that. Yeah, he listened, but Garfield, even though he was not always in sync with Lincoln, Garfield was a pretty vocal abolitionist, and Garfield was felt that Lincoln waited way too long to say that ending slavery was part of what the North was fighting for. So Garfield was more of a radical on that question even than Lincoln. Garfield, did say that he kind of wished the Republicans could find somebody else in 1864, but the people seemed to desire the reelection of Mr. Lincoln, and therefore it was not appropriate to push another candidate. And so Garfield kind of listened to the Chase stuff. He and Chase were very close, both being from Ohio and for a number of other reasons. But ultimately Garfield sort of grudgingly supported Lincoln in 1864, and nothing much else came from the movement to draft Chase. Lincoln knew all along what Chase was up to, by the way, and then once he was safely reelected, he shuffled Chase off to the Supreme Court. So he got rid of him in the cabinet and put Chase on the U.S. Supreme Court. What about John C. Fremont? John C. Fremont was very interesting in that he was the first Republican presidential candidate. The Republican Party was only formed in 1854 in response to the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So the first presidential election after the creation of the party was 1856. And John C. Fremont, who was somewhat famous as an explorer and as an Army officer, was actually nominated by the Republicans to run against James Buchanan in 1856. So Fremont does still have this, he's almost like a folk hero in that he is still at this point revered as the first Republican presidential candidate. He didn't beat Buchanan, obviously, but he made a decent showing in 1856, especially for a party that was only 2 years old at that point. So Fremont, was still out there, and he had continued to serve in the Army and had really kind of had some run-ins with Lincoln, and Lincoln was pretty frustrated with Fremont and had kind of sent him packing. And so Fremont was more than happy to have people continue to talk about perhaps him coming back and running for president again in 1864. That didn't happen. Obviously, you see there that the Radical Democracy Convention, as they called it, was held right here in Cleveland, Ohio in May of 1864, nominated Fremont for president. Nothing really came of that, and Fremont agreed that he would gladly step aside and withdraw from that if the Republicans nominated anyone but Lincoln. Of course, the Republicans didn't do that. So Fremont really ultimately is a non-factor here, but he's another Republican that people are at least talking about in 1864 as a potential alternative to Lincoln. Lincoln, of course, does win renomination. The Republican Party has its convention in Baltimore, which is significant in that, Maryland is a border state, and there was a lot of pro-slavery sentiment in Maryland. There was a lot of anti-slavery sentiment in Maryland, too. Again, it was a border state. So, but anyway, the Republicans have their convention in Baltimore. Lincoln is renominated, and the Republicans actually temporarily renamed themselves from Republican Party to the National Union Party in 1864 to really, hammer home that idea of union and reconciliation once the war was over. Something else they did, which probably seemed like a good idea at the time and turned out to be not such a good idea, was they decided in another effort to demonstrate even more reconciliation and true union, they nominated Andrew Johnson for vice president. The original vice president for the first 4 years of Lincoln's term was Hannibal Hamlin, who was from the state of Maine, and frankly would have probably been a much better president. Andrew Johnson was loyal to the Union. He was the only Southern senator to refuse to leave the Senate when his state, Tennessee, seceded. So he remained loyal to the North. He was military governor. He was the governor of Tennessee for a while during the war. But he was also, he was a Democrat also. Perhaps more significantly for American history, he was very much a racist and a white supremacist. And when he later became president, because of course we all know what happens to Lincoln, Johnson was very eager to see white supremacy very, very quickly reinstituted across the South. And that's a story for another presentation, I guess. But, the vice presidency several times over our history has been seen as a pretty insignificant office, not so much anymore, but in many times in our history, the vice presidency was really a place where somebody who was kind of a pain, you could kind of get rid of them by making them vice president. Probably the most famous example of that, besides Andrew Johnson, is Theodore Roosevelt. He was put on the ticket with William McKinley in 1900 because he was driving Republicans in New York insane as governor of New York. And so they thought, oh, we'll just get rid of him this way. now he's not now he's nobody, now he's not a problem anymore. And then of course McKinley gets assassinated too. So this is kind of the case with Andrew Johnson, but Johnson had appeal he was a Democrat, he was a Southerner, he was loyal to the Union, so there was some appeal to putting him on that ticket with Lincoln in 1864. Obviously, if anyone knew what was going to happen, I doubt very seriously Andrew Johnson rather would have been on that ticket. So who was going to be the Democratic nominee? You see the two major contenders here, Thomas Seymour and George McClellan. And McClellan is interesting in that he, until very recently, had been in the Army. He was a career soldier. He was a West Point graduate, fought in the Mexican-American War, had been overseas observing European conflicts like the Crimean War, very highly regarded in the Army, and twice had been hired and then fired by Lincoln as the commander of the Army of the Potomac. So Lincoln got rid of McClellan for the last time at the end of 1862, and McClellan rather, who was a lifelong Democrat, kind of decided to try to seek his revenge against Lincoln for firing him twice by running for president against Lincoln in 1864. I'm sure in his mind, McClellan felt like the ultimate revenge, of course, would be winning the election, but we all know how that worked out. So ultimately, McClellan is the one who rises to the top very quickly as the potential Democratic nominee, and of course does eventually win that nomination. I told you a little bit about kind of where the Republicans' heads were at this point. Now let's sort of look at what the Democrats were thinking. Of course, there were two major factions in the Democratic Party at this point: War Democrats and Peace Democrats, and those names are pretty self-explanatory. War Democrats, really opposed pretty much everything Lincoln suggested, but they did agree that the war needed to be fought to keep the Union together. They were not so much interested in abolition of slavery and certainly not in civil rights for formerly enslaved people later on. But they did agree that the war needed to be fought to keep the country together. And then there were the Peace Democrats, who were the Democrats who just wanted an immediate end to the war, let the South go and do whatever they want. What do we care? Let's just end this terrible war and bring our soldiers home and stop seeing these massive casualties take place. Peace Democrats were often called Copperheads. There's some pretty interesting political cartoons and imagery associated with that. Everybody knows, of course, a copperhead is a poisonous snake, and Lincoln called them the fire in the rear, meaning these were people who were from the North and were he assumed should be loyal to the Union and support the war effort, and yet they were kind of sniping at him from all angles, trying to convince him to end the war and negotiate peace with the Confederacy. So who would the Democrats select as their nominee? They did select McClellan. He had a lot of popular support, but the problem is McClellan was a war Democrat. Again, he'd been in the Army for his whole life. He had commanded many of these men in the Army of the Potomac twice. And, McClellan, while he certainly did not feel that the government should be trying to abolish slavery or to lift up African Americans, he did feel that the war needed to be fought to bring the South back and bring the Southern states back into the country. So McClellan's a war Democrat, but they nominated a peace Democrat, George Pendleton, for vice president, and they wrote a peace Democrat platform. So they have a platform that says this is who we are as Democrats, and this is what we stand for in 1864. And yet they nominated a candidate who stood for, in some cases, the complete opposite thing that was in the platform. So it was a very disjointed Democratic Party in 1864. And, in my view, they kind of had at least something of an opportunity to unseat Lincoln and remove him from office, by beating him in that election. And they kind of shot themselves in the foot by, creating really kind of a split in their own party that they really didn't need to have. As I mentioned, there are some great imagery about the Copperheads. Here's one of those. where you see, the female representation there of liberty, trying to fend off the copperheads, the snakes with human heads. McClellan, of course, obviously knew he was a war Democrat and knew he had been nominated on a peace platform. So he tried to sort of limit that damage as much as possible in his letter of acceptance. Of course, if you've been to any of the programs we do here about James Garfield, you know that even as far back as 1864, candidates for the presidency didn't really campaign for themselves. They kind of sat back and didn't say a whole lot, and they let the party do all the campaigning for them. The one time they really got to interact with the public was when they issued this letter of acceptance, accepting the nomination of their party. And so in this acceptance letter, McClellan tried to, sort of straddle the fence as best he could between that war Democrat philosophy that he believed in and the peace Democrat philosophy, which was reflected in the platform that party approved with him as its candidate. A lot of Democrats thought that the peace platform was just downright treasonous, that it was sacrilege to not fight the war and not try to keep the country together. There also were a lot of soldiers in the field who were Democrats, of course. And imagine being one of those soldiers, sitting out there in the mud and the cold, or in the blistering heat, and watching your friends get killed or maimed horribly by bullets and artillery shells, and then having a Democratic Party tell you that really what you're fighting for is not worth it and doesn't matter and shouldn't be continued. So that peace platform really alienated a lot of soldiers who were Democrats but were fighting in the field. It really alienated a lot of them and made them understandably so feel like the Democrats felt like what they were fighting for just didn't matter. And so, a lot of Democrats, when that peace platform was approved, declared that this was a huge mistake, and all they were going to do was drive Union soldiers right into the arms of the Republican Party. And for the most part, that did happen. A lot of these troops loved McClellan, even though he was hired and fired twice by Lincoln. That was primarily because he, in Lincoln's mind, didn't move quickly enough and was overly cautious with his army. But of course, if you're one of those soldiers, you like a commander who's overly cautious, because it means he's not sending you into battle without feeling fully prepared and like he's got all the information he needs. So McClellan personally was very popular with the troops. A lot of soldiers loved McClellan, but they also, were very much offended by this peace platform the Democrats had written that basically said what they were fighting for and sacrificing for should not be taking place. So as I said, there was some history here between Lincoln and McClellan. So here it's interesting that they're facing off against one another in politics. Lincoln had fired McClellan twice, and brought him back the second time really for the very reason I just talked about, the fact that McClellan was so popular with the troops. It was believed that if there was anybody these men would fight for and fight under, it was McClellan. So even though Lincoln had already fired him once, McClellan was viewed as the best choice to come back and lead that army a second time. McClellan, of course, as I mentioned earlier, was a lifelong Democrat. He was opposed to abolition. He was opposed to emancipation. He did not have very nice things to say about African Americans. And he didn't really have very nice things to say about Lincoln either. He viewed Lincoln as his inferior. He called Lincoln a buffoon and a guerrilla. He often refused to meet with Lincoln when Lincoln wanted to meet with him. There's a very famous story about a time when Lincoln decided, late in the evening he needed to talk to McClellan, and he actually went to the house in Washington where McClellan was staying. And McClellan wasn't there. He was out at a wedding or a party or something. And when he got home, Lincoln said, "Okay, that's no problem. I'll wait for him to get home." And then when McClellan got home, he was told, "The president is waiting to see you," and he refused to see the president and went upstairs and went to bed. So, McClellan kind of had a bit of a prickly personality, I guess you would say, but he certainly did not have great respect or affinity for Abraham Lincoln. And, Lincoln, being Lincoln, took a lot of this in stride. He didn't rant and rave. He didn't, he didn't throw a fit or get angry. He just kind of bided his time until he figured that McClellan's time was about up. So just a little bit more on kind of the history here between Lincoln and McClellan. Antietam, of course, in September of 1862 was probably the most famous battle at which McClellan commanded the Army of the Potomac. Tactically, the battle was basically a draw. It's the bloodiest single day in American history, 20-some thousand casualties in about 14 hours of fighting. That's 22 or 3,000 on both sides, so 23,000 or so total. So tactically, it's basically a draw, but strategically, it's more of a victory for the Union because it's the battle that is considered enough of a victory for the North that Lincoln feels comfortable about 5 days later issuing the Emancipation Proclamation and letting people know that as of January 1st, 1863, the North is now fighting not only to preserve the Union, but to abolish slavery. And these are just a couple of sort of funny quotes from Lincoln in his some of his communications with McClellan. As I said, McClellan had this reputation for being overly cautious and not wanting to move until he was 100% sure everything was exactly the way he wanted it, which it never is. It never was. And so, in trying to sort of prod McClellan along, at one point Lincoln says, if you're not using the Army, I'd like to borrow it for a little while. At one point after Antietam, when, again, strategically, at least the North has won, Lincoln is eager to see McClellan start moving and pursuing the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, which is leaving Maryland and going back into Virginia. And McClellan continues to give excuses about why he can't get his army moving just yet. And at one point, he notes that his horses are very fatigued from all of the exertion. And this is a month or so after the battle, and Lincoln finally gets frustrated and says, pardon me for asking what the horses of your army have done since the Battle of Antietam to fatigue anything. Meaning, you've been sitting there too long, you need to get moving and go chase Robert E. Lee and potentially end the war or strike a major blow against the Confederacy. And of course, McClellan didn't do that. He waited and waited and waited. And finally, in November of 1862, Lincoln fired him for the second and final time. Again, things were not, all rosy in the Republican Party either. A lot of radical Republicans were getting disillusioned with Lincoln. They were worried that his commitment to the civil rights of enslaved people was not going to be as strong as it should be when the war ended. Obviously, this feeling was predicated on the North winning the war. So radicals were starting to wonder if, Lincoln was really going to be as strong an ally to African Americans after the war as he now was trying to be with things like the Emancipation Proclamation. They didn't like, the radical Republicans did not like a lot of Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction. They thought that those plans were far too lenient. Lincoln wanted a lenient and a relatively easy Reconstruction for the South because he felt like that was one of the primary ways that the country could avoid the spectacle of white people attacking Black people and having this deep resentment for the formerly enslaved in the South. Lincoln recognized that if we make Reconstruction harsh and punitive and really make white Southerners feel very deeply that, we are blaming you for this war and you have to pay this very significant price for starting this war, that was going to create resentment among white Southerners. And of course, they were going to take that out on the formerly enslaved people that were at that point then going to be moving among them. And that's exactly what happened. Radicals wanted this harsh, punitive South. They wanted the South to pay a very severe price for having started the war. They wanted the army in the South to occupy the South and to guarantee the civil rights and physical safety of the formerly enslaved. And they worried that Lincoln wasn't as dedicated to this cause as they were. And so they wanted this very harsh, punitive Reconstruction, and Lincoln wanted a much softer Reconstruction in the South, precisely to prevent what ended up happening. So Lincoln, proposed this very lenient Reconstruction program. The Republicans, the radical Republicans, counter with the Wade-Davis bill, which establishes this much more severe and harsh Reconstruction. Under the Wade-Davis plan, 50% of the white men in a former Confederate state had to swear a loyalty oath. They had to swear that they would accept emancipation. And of course, the radical Republicans in Congress, would administer Reconstruction, not the president. In Lincoln's plan, obviously, the president would administer Reconstruction. Lincoln pocket vetoed this bill, basically meaning he didn't take any action on it, and he let the congressional session expire. And of course, at that point, since the session was over and he hadn't taken any action on it, it was dead. And that really, really, really bothered those radicals. They got very angry with Lincoln. So this is another thing that really made them very unhappy with Abraham Lincoln. As I mentioned earlier, James Garfield, who you see there in the photo on your screen, was one of the radical Republicans who was pretty frustrated with Abraham Lincoln. He was very vocally anti-slavery. Garfield knew and wrote in his diary and in letters as soon as the war started that slavery really was the root cause of what this war was all about. Yes, you can talk about states' rights and the economy and the different interpretations of the Constitution, but ultimately all those arguments can kind of be traced back to being primarily about slavery. And Garfield recognized that even then. And Garfield was again, not always very happy with Lincoln, but kind of grudgingly agreed to back Lincoln in 1864, simply because Garfield felt like that's what people wanted. The rank and file Republicans out in the country were supportive of Lincoln having a second term, being the nominee in 1864, and Garfield, even though he considered himself a radical Republican, was sort of willing to grudgingly go along with that. Because of course, even when Garfield was frustrated with Lincoln was still better than any Democrat. And so, in Garfield's mind, so even though he was not always pleased with Lincoln, he still would much rather see Lincoln in office than a Democratic president. The campaign, we tend to think of politics in this era as being a little nicer, a little more genteel. It was a gentleman's profession, and that's just not true. We're used to the campaigns that we see today where, candidates often go after one another's, records or personal lives or whatever. And we tend to think that, that used to be such a more polite way to run for office. And that's really not the case. You see some political cartoons here that show Abraham Lincoln in a very bad light. These would have been obviously in Democratic newspapers. And then correspondingly, we have some anti-McClellan cartoons that would have appeared in Republican papers. So it was not exactly a genteel or polite campaign by any means. And really a lot of the campaigns in the 19th century, this was the case. Some have said that believe it or not, the election of 1800 between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson is the dirtiest, most dirty tricks of any campaign in American history. And again, we tend to, especially with somebody like Jefferson and Adams, who were, founding fathers, we tend to think of them being a little better than that and a little more polite. And it just was not the case. Those campaigns often tended to be very personal and very dirty. Here's a list of some of the names that Lincoln was called during the campaign by Democratic members of the Democratic Party, but also Democratic newspapers. A filthy storyteller, a despot, liar, thief, braggart, buffoon, usurper, fiend, butcher, and there's any number of other ones as well. So again, this is not a nice, quiet, polite handshake kind of campaign. As I mentioned at the beginning, Lincoln went into 1864 convinced that he was going to lose, and he maintained that feeling really well into the campaign. He famously wrote this letter on August 23rd of 1864. He wrote the letter and then he made all of his cabinet members sign it without letting them read it. He just told them, sign this, and then he sort of folded it up and put it in a desk drawer. And what it was basically a pledge to work with, and this is actually timely right now as we're hearing about all of this, one campaign not, working with the other for a peaceful transition and all this kind of stuff. But this was basically Lincoln's way of avoiding exactly what we're seeing in the news today with all these questions about a presidential transition. The letter read, "This morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be reelected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the president-elect as to save the Union between the election and the inauguration, as he will have secured his election on such grounds that he cannot possibly save it afterwards." So this is basically Lincoln saying, if he is beaten for reelection, he's got to try to work with McClellan to bring the war to a successful close before McClellan takes office, because once McClellan takes office as president in March of 1864, he's been elected on that Democratic peace platform, and so he's going to be expected to negotiate an immediate peace with the South. And that means that slavery will not be abolished, at least in that part of the country, and the Union will not be saved. It will not be preserved. It will become two separate countries. And so Lincoln writes this letter in late summer of 1864, and he has all of his cabinet members sign it, basically so that if in fact McClellan wins and they're all upset and unhappy and refusing to work with McClellan to ensure a peaceful transition, Lincoln can pull this out and say, well, you agreed to do it, so you're going to do it. So what were Lincoln's chances in this election? He argued that it would not be a good idea to change horses in midstream. You've probably heard that colloquialism before, and that's where this came from, is Lincoln saying in 1864 that, it's probably not a good idea to change horses in midstream, meaning changing administrations in the middle of a civil war is not a good idea. There were a number of Northern Democrats who were frustrated with their own party because of the peace platform, and so a lot of Democrats did consider and ended up crossing party lines to vote for Lincoln. There were moderate Democrats who went into Lincoln's column when he got rid of Hamlin and brought Johnson along. They kind of bought into this idea of creating a Union strategy. Obviously, McClellan was running against his own philosophy, ran against that of his party. The Republican platform took a firm stand on the war and on Reconstruction, vowing not only to crush the Confederacy and punish Confederate leaders, but also to institute a work for a constitutional amendment banning slavery. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of soldiers in the field, even many of them Democrats, ended up crossing party lines to vote for Lincoln as well, because they really didn't like the Democratic Party's stance on negotiating an immediate peace with the Confederates. Something else that really helped Lincoln's chances were a couple of key victories in the war, really kind of leading up to the election. General William Tecumseh Sherman captured Atlanta at the beginning of September of 1864. That was a major victory for the South to take that major southern city. And then, of course, as soon as he took Atlanta, he then started, or shortly after taking Atlanta, he then started on the very famous March to the Sea, which actually will be the topic of our program in December. So if you're interested in that, come listen to that one on the second Wednesday in December. So Sherman then started the March to the Sea, where he went from Atlanta all the way to the coast at Savannah, causing this swath of destruction across Georgia. And then once he reached Savannah, started to cut north to link up with other Union armies and really start putting the Confederate armies in kind of a vice grip there. So the siege and capture of Atlanta. And then the Battle of Cedar Creek in Virginia on October 19th, 1864, just a couple of weeks before presidential election. That was another major victory. The Shenandoah Valley had been fought over for the entire Civil War up to this point, had changed hands many, many times. And then finally, once and for all, in October at Cedar Creek, Union forces under General Philip Sheridan finally secured the Shenandoah Valley. So it's clear that the war is winding down, and it's clear that the North has the upper hand and is in all likelihood going to win the war. I've already talked a little bit about the soldier vote. Grant and leadership of the Union and of the Union armies made sure that soldiers did have the opportunity to vote in the field. So this is kind of an early example of absentee ballots, I guess you would say. They did make sure that soldiers who were citizens and who were able to exercise their right to vote were able to vote in the field, because they knew that the majority of soldiers were going to be with Lincoln. And that was the case. You know, certainly the soldiers who were Republicans, but even many of those who identified as Democrats, because they were so upset about the peace platform that the Democratic Party ran on, that they ended up crossing party lines to vote for Lincoln. So here's the election day. The Lincoln states are in blue. I know today, you know, we're used to seeing Republican states red and Democratic states blue, but in this case, on this map, blue is the states won by Lincoln, and you can see the red are the states won by the Democrats, by McClellan, and there aren't very many of them. Kentucky, Delaware, and New Jersey. Delaware is a border state. It's a state that actually does have slavery within its boundaries. It's a teeny tiny amount of enslaved people in Delaware, but technically it is a border state. And then New Jersey is interesting because the one political office that George McClellan is able to be elected to a few years later is governor of New Jersey. So New Jersey was Democratic at this point and did go for McClellan in 1864. So you can see Lincoln wins with 55% of the popular vote, about 2.2 million votes to McClellan's 1.8 million. And Lincoln, of course, wins overwhelmingly in the Electoral College because, of course, we all know the Electoral College is what ultimately determines the presidency. And Lincoln had an overwhelming victory in the Electoral College, 212 to just 21 electoral votes for McClellan. So it is an overwhelming victory for Lincoln and the Republican Party. Lincoln is sworn in for his second term on March 4th of 1865. And of course, this is an excerpt from his second inaugural. Many historians consider this speech to be Lincoln's greatest. Those who don't consider this the greatest consider it maybe the second greatest. A lot of people feel the Gettysburg Address is probably the greatest Lincoln speech, and this is a close second. Others feel that this is the best. But he, of course, refers back to, you know, when they met, you know, initially 4 years ago for the same occasion. All the thoughts were anxiously directed to an impending civil war. All dreaded it, all sought to avert it. While the inaugural address was being delivered from this place, devoted altogether to saving the Union without war, insurgent agents were in the city seeking to destroy it without war, seeking to dissolve the Union and divide effects by negotiation. Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. And then, of course, the very famous conclusion to the second inaugural: with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. So you can see why this is considered one of Lincoln's greatest speeches. He's also kind of laying out his philosophy here on Reconstruction, on how the two sides should treat one another and interact with one another when the war is over. Again, Lincoln wants that lenient, relatively easy Reconstruction for the South, not because he's, happy that the South has, has been fighting to secede and to preserve slavery for the last 4 years, but because he knows that by being punitive, by being harsh with the South, all he's really doing is building up resentment among white Southerners to abolition and to emancipation. And so he's trying to make Reconstruction as easy as possible for the benefit of the people who will soon be formerly enslaved people rather than slaves. And then, of course, we all know how the story ends for Abraham Lincoln. Just about 6 weeks into his second term, he's assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer originally from Maryland, another border state. Booth, thinks he is avenging the South. This assassination takes place just 5 days after Robert E. Lee surrenders. That is not the end of the Civil War. In fact, the war goes on for another, month and a half or maybe a little bit more before all Confederate armies have finally surrendered. But it's viewed by most as, really, for the most part, the writing is clearly on the wall once Lee surrenders. The most famous and probably most powerful Confederate army, the Army of Northern Virginia. So 5 days later, Booth assassinates Lincoln, and he, of course, says he's doing this to avenge the South. And in reality, all Booth did was kill the South's best friend. Lincoln was the guy who wanted to treat the South with kid gloves and to treat the South as gently as possible, again, to make that transition from slavery to freedom that much easier for African Americans. So even though Booth thinks he's doing the South a favor by killing Lincoln, all he really does is throw Reconstruction into the hands of the radical Republicans in Congress, and they then, institute a very harsh, very punitive Reconstruction on the South, and that accomplishes exactly what Lincoln thought it would, which was makes white Southerners extremely angry, makes them extremely resentful towards the formerly enslaved, and leads to things like Jim Crow laws and lynchings and all these other terrible things that are an ugly part of our history. Had Lincoln lived and been able to institute the plan that he had for Reconstruction, then it's entirely possible that the whole history of race relations in this country might be very different than it ended up playing out. So that is the conclusion of my, a very quick look at the election of 1864. So Kaylee, if anybody has questions through the chat or verbally, I'll try to answer those.
I have a random question. When did they start doing the inauguration in January instead of March? The Constitution was amended for that in the early 1930s. So Franklin D. Roosevelt was inaugurated for his first term on March 4th, 1933. While he was president, that change went in, or during that first term of his, that change went into effect. And so when he was inaugurated for his second term, it was January 20th, 1937. And so that change took place in the early 1930s, and then that's been the case ever since. Of course, the FDR is elected 4 times. After FDR dies, Republicans say, okay, we think 2 terms is enough. And that's also, so it's really kind of, FDR related there. That's also why we have the constitutional amendment that says presidents can only be elected to 2 terms. And then, of course, almost immediately, the Republicans themselves had a president in Eisenhower who probably could have been elected to a 3rd term in 1960 if he'd been able to run, but he couldn't.
Judith, did you have a question?
Yes. How many presidents previous to Lincoln had won the election for more than 1 term?
Oh gosh, good question. Well, let's see. George Washington did 2 full terms. John Adams was 1 term. Jefferson had 2 terms. James Madison had 2 terms. James Monroe had 2 terms. Andrew Jackson had 2 terms. That may be it until Lincoln.
Quite a few.
Yeah, quite a few. But there were also a lot of presidents who
either were defeated for a second term. John Adams, for example, Martin Van Buren. The first president to die in office was William Henry Harrison, who became president in early 1841. So obviously he didn't serve a full term. In fact, he only served a month. And then there were a few other presidents, probably the most significant being James K. Polk, who was elected in 1844, who very vocally said, I'm only interested in serving one term. And so didn't seek a second term, just did 4 years and said, that's it for me. And then there have been and Franklin Pierce did that as well, who was elected in 1852. And then after the Civil War, Rutherford B. Hayes, of course, from Ohio, did that as well, also said he only would serve a single term if he won, and did in fact stick to that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'll say that December 9th at noon is the next one of these. It'll be me one more time. So if you're tired of my face and my voice, you get a month off, but then I'm back on December 9th. And the subject that time, as I mentioned during the program, is Sherman's March to the Sea. So we'll be talking about that in December, if you're interested in that.
Good. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.